Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Where'd my screen go? Here it is. Um, this is not a long introduction, but to the point. Kate Aronoff is a staff writer at the New Republic, where she, I guess, writes a weekly column. Her author page goes on for many iterations. Her work has also appeared in The Intercept, The New York Times, The Nation, Dissent, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian. She is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal from Verso, and is the co-editor of We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style, from the New Press. Kate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug, and thanks so much everyone for organizing this event and for joining. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I will start off with pretty brief set of kind of opening remarks, just maybe orienting us to the subject a bit and to what we'll talk about, and Doug and I will talk for a while, and then I'm excited to get into a bit of Q&A and open up the conversation and kind of hear what you all are interested in hearing about. So, I'll start off by saying I cannot claim to be the most well-read person, maybe even on this call, in eco-socialist theory and socialist theory. I, spend my sort of day-to-day as a reporter. I talk to a lot of people. I, have read a decent amount on the subject, but a lot of what I kind of know is just really from being a beat reporter for the last 10 years and being in and around the climate movement for a bit longer than that. And that's, I think where I'm coming from, in case anybody, was expecting a very long lecture about John Bellamy Foster or something like that. This may not be the evening for you. But, I wanted to talk just a bit about why, as a socialist myself, as someone who is engaged in climate politics, a socialist perspective is a really useful way to understand the world, and why I believe very deeply that an eco-socialist politics is the most viable path, toward getting sort of any progress on this issue at all, which admittedly can look very bleak, especially if any of you spent any time looking over the latest intergovernmental panel on climate change report. So I won't spend a lot of time going through, or really very much time at all going through the sort of specifics of the case. Climate change is very bad. It stands to kill a lot of people. The report released yesterday finds that about half of humanity already is extremely vulnerable to the climate crisis. And just to say sort of off the bat, that is an extremely cruel process, which is the product of colonialism, the product of years of capitalist development, centuries of capitalist development, and the impacts of this crisis are being felt worst in the parts of the world that have had the least to do with creating it, right? The global north, the United States in particular, is the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet, and has an outsized responsibility for dealing with this problem, and specifically to transition our own economy very rapidly away from fossil fuels, and to make that possible, right, for other parts of the world through various sorts of climate finance, which is a big theme running through the latest IPCC report, and has been the sort of consistent demand for resource transfers from north to south, from folks who've been showing up to the UN climate talks and other sort of global spaces for a very long time, to pay back this historical debt that the United States owes to the rest of the world. So that's really what I'll say about the crisis itself. But I want to talk a little bit just about what sort of socialism adds to that. I think there was a maybe plausible reading of U.S. politics in the weeks and months after Joe Biden was elected, that the climate movement, after years of protests, had sort of pushed the conversation very far, right? That we were seeing a level of investment that proposed in the American Jobs Plan that, was not on the table, certainly under the Obama administration, obviously not under Trump administration. And there was talk that, the climate left, as it were, had kind of won the debate, right? All of these things were on the table. Everything, all of these things looked possible in a way that they hadn't before. The climate left had won was a thing that was said by, semi-serious pundits for a very long time. That looks a bit differently now. Hopes for comprehensive federal climate legislation look a bit dim. That's not to say that the terrain hasn't changed a lot, but there is still a long way to go to passing comprehensive federal climate policy, which could be a very long way off. And so what eco-socialism, to my mind, really adds to that conversation, where certainly big dollar amounts are on the table, where there's a more ambitious conversation about climate policy happening, is first off to provide a sort of framework for understanding what kind of world we're working toward, right? And the best vision of socialism, there is a sort of much more ambitious horizon that people are struggling to attain, right? A more fair, democratic, and just world that we are looking to bring into being. And that is not really answered, right, by looking for $500 billion worth of clean energy tax credits, for instance, or 330 in the most recent proposal, right? It is not a sort of vision that is laid out when you say you're going to make an electric vehicle cheaper. And I think, right now we're seeing some of the results of that, of not sort of having a more holistic vision of the world that we're working toward, that is wider spread, right? For, the strengths of potential strengths, you could say, about the proposals for federal climate policy, the ways in which Build Back Better improves on previous plans. It is not a vision of a better world, right? And that is something that I have been really excited to see in the DSA Eco-Socialist working groups, sort of campaigns at the local level here in New York, at the national level, and work, especially that I've been paying attention to around work to make make public utilities truly public, right? To not have that be subject to profit making, and to really sort of deeply transform the means of energy production in the way that it's very cleanly spelled out in the science of climate change, right? And so having a much sort of more holistic vision to work toward, I think, is something that eco-socialism does, which more progressive climate politics doesn't often, right? And that is easy to get lost, especially in something as sort of grave and as dystopian as the climate crisis can sometimes be, and as an anecdote against a real pessimism that I hear certainly all the time talking to people about climate change as a reporter, and is really necessary in order to give people a real impetus to be working towards something, and locating that work toward eco-socialism in workplaces, in sort of places where you have access to, right? Whether that's your local utility or your shop floor, right? That there is a struggle which is there and ready to be waged in the here and now, and it's not a matter of reading a spreadsheet, which I spend, or a very depressing PDF, which I spend a lot of my time doing, and I can't in good conscience recommend to very many people. And that socialist organizing provides a way for people to engage in problem which can feel very overwhelming, even to people sort of working on those campaigns, but a sort of piece of that to really bite off and work toward. The other thing I wanted to say is just sort of the ways that a socialist perspective is a helpful methodology, I think, to understand the climate crisis. About 10 years ago, when I started paying attention to this stuff, 10, 15 years ago, there was, a lot of talk about this thing called greenwashing, right? Which folks are probably familiar with. This sort of idea that corporations will paint, their polluting activities or whatever they're doing as green, by, saying that we're offsetting some emissions, we, have a LEED certified building or headquarters, these sort of surface level things used to burnish their image and make them seem like they're good actors politically and for the climate. And in the last several years, I think that picture has gotten just a bit more complicated, right? There is, as sort of, market conditions have shifted, as regulatory environments have shifted, particularly in Europe, there's real money to be made in a clean energy economy. And that can be very confusing if you're coming at this from a sort of traditional liberal perspective, or have a sort of understanding of solar and wind companies, for instance, as these good actors that are just looking to make the world a better place. And as a socialist, it's and plenty of good business press and capitalists do this too. And there's a lot to be learned from places like the Financial Times and good business reporters and Bloomberg and that. But a real sort of materialist analysis, allows you to look at different arms of capital and the ways that they're responding, not, as a unified mass to both the crisis itself and the ways in which the energy economy is changing, and it is changing not fast enough, but in pretty remarkable ways, and be able to sort out, what are different arms of capital doing? What is finance doing that the fossil fuel industry, for instance, is not doing, right? They have very different material interests, they have different drivers, and they operate, differently, and that can be sort of fertile ground for strategies as people who would like to build a non-capitalist world and a more socialist society. And I think that in places like the UNFCCC, UN climate talks, the sort of business interests of certain arms of capital can get confused for political strategy, right? This happens in Washington as well. And what is in the sort of best interest of a BlackRock or a Siemens or big sort of green capital interest is not either the sort of best in the best interest of the planet, and neither is it a sort of compelling political strategy. For many years in the US, as people may well be aware, there was this idea that bringing together a sort of coalition of business and climate folks and green groups and all of that would result in this grand compromise that would produce climate policy, which would get us where we need to be. We had already seen, in 2010, in the fight over cap and trade in Washington, D.C., that was not the case, right? That as soon as they got the chance, some of the, most polluting arms of capital turned against that coalition after having watered down the policy as much as they could, and it didn't pass. And, we're seeing something similar again now, right? And that, creating a climate policy that is essentially a series of tax breaks for business is a very tough thing to argue for, and not a terribly compelling thing to build a big coalition around, regardless of the many structural reasons why it's very difficult to pass climate policy in the United States. And so being able to just analyze conditions as they are, as they're evolving, and things are changing very rapidly in the sort of climate, clean energy space and the world of climate politics, I think is something that is a certain brand of liberalism can cloud the brain about how how the clean energy economy is evolving and how to respond to the climate crisis in good conscience, and with a political strategy which can actually aim at making the sorts of transformative shifts that are needed. And maybe the last thing I'll say, just to before we go into talking sort of back and forth, is internationalism and the sort of deep commitment to a really internationalist vision of the world that is unique to eco-socialism, and for all of, I think, the positive ways in which the conversation about the Green New Deal has pushed forward our understandings of the climate crisis and what needs to be done about it. One of the weaker arms of at least the sort of more mainstream iterations of the way it gets expressed in Congress has been on the international front, right? And the Green New Deal, as it gets expressed in many places, not, I think in DSA, not in, I will say some of the things I've written with comrades who are also in DSA, is as a sort of national development strategy, right? As a way to build a thriving, growing, clean energy economy in the United States that does not really look beyond its borders. And I think it's incumbent upon socialists and an eco-socialist approach to politics in general to look at up and down the supply chains of what that clean energy economy looks like, and see not sort of productive inputs of semiconductors or batteries or lithium or things like that, but to see those products as a product of labor, right? As a product of people who, are undergoing their own labor struggles in their own country, and see those as potential points of intervention and solidarity, rather than as a sort of means toward an end of a greener United States, right? And to look at the, long-standing struggles of climate justice organizers in other parts of the world who have, pushed forward demands that are now mainstream, right? The demand for 1.5 degrees came directly from folks who are living in climate vulnerable countries for whom that goal is a really existential, is an existential one. And, really seeing the limits of longstanding U.S. climate policy throughout sort of Republican and Democratic administrations, and finding grounds for solidarity with people who have been on the losing end of those policies, and the losing end of U.S. empire, certainly, and looking to build a truly internationalist and global Green New Deal that is really finding ways to link these struggles in different places, and not, limiting itself to a vision just for the United States. So I'll stop there. That was, a couple of pretty divergent points, but I'm excited to hear what Doug wants to talk about.
Thank you. That was really good. Good way to start. A couple of things. I have several questions here. And what you're talking about at the end piqued my interest. I hadn't prepared this one, but my old friend Tom Athanasiou had a big hand in writing the international portion of the Sanders campaign, Sanders climate proposal. And he made it emphasized, and he did a book, The Divided Planet, 15, 20 years ago. So he's always had equity as an important part of global equity, as an important part of any climate plan. And he talked about, for example, the importance of resource transfers to the South to get anything serious done. Has that remained in the conversation, or has it dropped out?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a conversation at the international level. I think that as we've seen over the last several weeks, the ways in which the domestic climate conversation has gotten more ambitious and progressive over the last 2-3 years has not entirely translated into foreign policy, on many fronts. The most sort of recent numbers, which were referenced in sort of coverage of the IPCC report the other day, showed that the massive gap between the financing that's needed and what's on offer is still in place. There was this $100 billion pledge from wealthy countries, I believe in 2012, to finance climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. And that has not happened. Those pledges have gone unmet, and very little of that money has gone toward adaptation, toward making places, more resilient. And a lot of it has taken the form of loans, right? Which for countries historically burdened by structural adjustment packages, by predatory World Bank and IMF packages, is obviously a problem, to be sort of ensnared into deeper debt. And there's even sort of more nefarious structuring around mitigation, especially sort of renewable and even adaptation financing, in the strive to make return generating assets out of what should be public goods, things, everything from solar farms to, wind turbines to seawalls, or, cities looking to capital markets to finance resiliency infrastructure. So that has really picked up, especially as the sort of ESG craze has taken off since 2020 or so. But there have been a lot of, there has been progress, I would say, in the UN space on the climate finance front. This last year's talks in 2021 in Glasgow, I believe was the first time the US mentioned the words loss and damage, which has been getting a sort of dedicated finance facility for loss and damage. This is repairing climate disasters which have already happened, has been a very longstanding demand the US has really aggressively pushed back on for many years. It pushed back on it again in Glasgow, but did say the words at least, which feels like a pretty hell of a victory, but fought back against this dedicated finance facility, agreed to a dialogue, which don't need to get into the sort of vagaries of UN vocabulary, but there's a more active conversation at the international level, at least, around climate finance, but conversations about equity are still pretty hard to come by and difficult to have.
Okay, and turning to the domestic angle again, the politics of a green transition could be really dicey, assuming we even get near there. I mean, it seems inevitable that energy would have to get more expensive, or at least some forms of energy, as they move away from carbon and towards renewables. Sure, the price of renewables is going to drop in the long term, but fossil fuels won't go away overnight. They can get expensive as new production is squeezed and sources run dry, and we're seeing some of that now. And the entire carbon-intensive global supply chain really needs a major overhaul, which means shortages and inflation. And we see the political controversies around the current level of inflation, and more of this could be very damaging. So how do we handle the politics of this if it creates such short-term disruption that you could have a hard time talking to people about the longer-term payoffs?
Yeah, good, very small question.
Yes, I know. Just a trivial one to start off with.
Of an energy transition. Yeah, I mean, maybe can answer this sort of in two parts. So we'll start off talking about the United States, where I think in some ways the politics of this are a bit easier than they are in other parts of the world, which I'll get into. But the U.S. historically has had unbelievably, just considering sort of some of the nonsense that I'm sure New Yorkers have been seeing around Con Edison, raising rates, and all that nonsense. The U.S. has historically had much lower fuel prices than and home heating prices and rates of fuel poverty than some parts of Europe, for instance, which is definitely not to say it's not a massive problem and worth running very active campaigns around to bring those utilities that are scraping rent off of these things into public ownership, as well we should. But in the U.S., our sort of matrix of fossil fuel subsidies is really robust on the consumer and the producer end. But as fuel prices and oil prices, and particularly, have gone up, there's this real reticence by policymakers at a lot of levels. I pay most attention to the national level, so I'll talk about that, to explore sort of wider range of tools for what controlling that might look like, or for what mediating the impacts of rising fuel prices might look like. And we're seeing some of the sort of political blowback of that right now. And so traditionally, energy production in the US is really anarchic compared to the vast majority of oil producers on Earth, who generally have some sort of national oil company, some sort of state say, at least, over levels of production can sort of suggest to these companies, which tend to be quite close to the government, what levels they should be producing, or membership in a body like OPEC, which is a boogeyman in the U.S., but functions essentially in the way that U.S. oil production did for a little while, at least, as a cartel, which can move the sort of global commodity price in particular directions. So because the U.S. has ceded these authorities to private companies, in some cases, many hundreds of private companies, not just the sort of big names like Exxon and Chevron, there are very sort of few tools to either to ramp up production, as some people have called for over the last week, but there are tools that can be used to sort of to control prices. That there's been a debate around in sort of econ Twitter over the last several weeks, but that I think some of those tools, like pricing strategies, could be really useful as we're thinking about an energy transition, right? Because making sure that it's companies that pay the cost of this transition and not sort of ordinary people is important, from a sort of ethical, moral perspective, right? That it's these companies which have caused these problems and need to be, gone after, but also, just from a sort of realpolitik strategic perspective, right? That if people's main engagement with a drive toward decarbonization is to see their gas prices go up, is to see their home heating prices go up, that provokes a backlash, as we've seen with the Gilets jaunes movement in France. It's not hard to see that path, right? If a carbon price, which has been the way that sort of mainstream environmental economists and sort of climate policy people talked about the need for climate policy for a long time, that is politically very dubious, because its main effect is to make life more expensive, and doesn't include a plan for federal investment in things like heat pumps and retrofitting housing and public transit, which could decarbonize daily life, right? To make people's sort of day-to-day realities less entwined with this set of global commodities whose price can go up and down, as we need. So, I mean, the answer, to your question is probably the one you were maybe expecting, which is that we need a Green New Deal, and to invest really heavily in public decarbonized goods, public transit, public housing, public utilities, public power, that will really, make sure that it is not working people who are bearing the brunt of decarbonization, but put these costs, where they should be, right? Onto energy producers, onto the companies which have gotten us into this mess. And I think, as part of that, and that's, the sort of ideal world. And, that's not to say that there won't be fluctuations in the price of energy and some real bumps along the road in terms of energy getting more expensive, as it probably will, but these public investments are a way to insulate people, right, from the impacts of that. And along the road, I think some level of whether we want to call it state planning or not, or considering a sort of control on the price of energy, is probably necessary to make sure that that sort of haywire activity does not just provoke this huge backlash, which would be great for fossil fuel executives if the first sort of step in the decade of decarbonization were massive public resistance to those policies. So I think it's the Green New Deal is like the short answer. I wrote a book about it with some DSA Eco-Socialist comrades that called A Planet to Win, that folks can read if they'd like. But having a sort of range of tools at disposal, including the potential to nationalize fossil fuel companies, the fossil fuel sector, to make it look a bit more like a normal fossil fuel producing country, and have a say over how those natural resources are used, which has been a popular demand at various points in time. Could be a big part of that, and really paying close attention to questions of ownership, not only in traditional energy sectors, but also over wind and solar, and make sure that we're not just empowering sort of a new class of green rentiers to jack up the cost of charging an electric car, for instance, because they have a monopoly over the charging infrastructure. So to really have a thorough look at the kind of ownership structures that are being built into a green energy economy.
I noticed this morning that Elon Musk is making charging free in Ukraine. This is his gesture of solidarity. We're seeing some climate-related initiatives coming out of big finance. Of course, you mentioned BlackRock, Larry Fink's company, with about $10 trillion under management. A former employee of his, Brian Deese, is a major figure in economic and climate policy in the Biden administration. And I've heard some criticism that he's just more about words than deeds. And we're also seeing banks and other asset managers signing net zero pledges, the Net Zero Banking Alliance. How much do these things mean? Are they distractions? Are they something we can work with? And is there a difference between net zero and real zero?
Yeah, we are living in the era of net zero pledges. I mean, this kicked off, I date it back to Larry Fink's investor letter right before the pandemic that he released, I believe, at Davos in January 2020, laying out the sort of vision of stakeholder capitalism, that BlackRock was going to be a good actor on the climate stage. And for folks who aren't familiar with BlackRock, it's the world's largest asset manager, now controlling, I believe, $10 trillion, has $10 trillion worth of assets under management, also provides this sort of risk management software to banks called Aladdin, to banks and including central banks, that is basically ubiquitous across the global financial system and has a really massive political footprint. So they not only, as you mentioned, have people like Brian Deese, head of the National Economic Council. The Deputy Treasury Secretary is a former BlackRock executive, and there I think there are a couple other people in the administration, and they sort of swooped in very actively after the global financial crisis in 2008 to become the not JP Morgan Chase, the not Wall Street banks, the good guys of Wall Street, and sort of present themselves as these enlightened asset managers who are just storing other people's money toward good ends, and are out to be responsible titans of capitalism in a way that the big banks were not after the Great Recession. And so they've been, I would say, a very important part of this move toward net zero pledges. And companies really do pay attention to what they're doing, in part because they're a major stakeholder in some outrageous number of companies. I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but they have very, very sort of widespread stakes in many of the biggest companies on Earth, if not are major stakeholders, if not in some cases have a big say in what companies do, as well as what a sort of ear into the Biden administration. And so after that letter was put out, you started to see a whole range of companies, a lot of folks in the financial sector come out with these net zero pledges. So what does net zero mean? Generally, the structure of these pledges is that at some point after 2050, there will be a technology invented which will be able to capture carbon that has been emitted into the atmosphere or in other greenhouse gases, but generally carbon. We'll be able to capture that and sort of make up for the overshoot of carbon that we have not zeroed out up to that point, right? And so that assumes a lot, right, about what that technology will look like, which is currently pretty speculative. There is no, this has never been done at any kind of scale that these pledges or even sort of mainstream climate modeling suggest it should in order to qualify these pledges. That is, what net zero means. Real zero would be actually just getting to zero, right? Actually making sure that the emissions as of 2050 at the very latest, that should be much sooner in the United States and other wealthy countries, which can make that transition more quickly. Actually getting to zero and not sort of putting that problem up off into the future and hoping that there's a technology invented which will be able to suck that up. But the net zero pledges themselves don't really get into that level of detail. Often, a company will come out and say, we are aiming for net zero, but the financial sector is a good sort of case study in this, because if you look at sort of major asset managers or major banks, they continue to hold massive investments in many cases coal stacks, but particularly oil and gas, billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in investments, according to the latest reports put out by the Rainforest Action Network, who compile a lot of this data for campaigns that they're working on. But that, in the sort of logic of net zero pledges is not inherently contradictory, right? Because what the real value add of sort of cashing in on net zero is to have some sort of new green product that you're selling alongside as you continue to invest in coal, oil, and gas, right? And so if you're BlackRock, you can say, we have this green sustainable ETF that if you're looking to invest, your funds with us, you can buy and feel good about that. And those are, a very small portion of the products that they sell, right? Most of the business that they do are these passive investment funds, which are invested, any number of places, including in ExxonMobil and Chevron and very, very polluting companies. But they can point to these, very niche products and say, we are, being positive actors in the world for the climate. We are helping drive this movement forward. Meanwhile, don't look at the sort of dirty assets that we're continuing to invest in. Don't look at the coal, oil, and gas that is in our portfolio. And that is true, by and large across the financial sector, right? Even sort of major investment banks will continue to invest in oil and gas, and including companies that are expanding really rapidly out of step with the Paris Climate Agreement, while saying that our commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement means that we, are really taking this seriously and look at all of our investments in solar and wind and renewable and carbon capture and things like this. So there's not a lot of consistency, I would say, in net zero pledges, and there aren't really rules about it either. So there's no authority which is going to come out and say your net zero pledge is not, in line with the Paris Agreement. There, of course, activists will say that, but even in terms of sustainable investment, right? The EU is just starting to develop its taxonomy for what sustainable investment means, which could well include, especially now, gas, right? Which brings a tremendous amount of methane into the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas that's 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide over the next 20 years. So that could get the sort of stamp of approval to say this is a green investment, and the sort of growing amount of money that's interested in these ESG products, in investing sustainably, can go there, and that will be considered a green investment. And so that is, I would say, the standard for the financial sector is that there is money to be made in these sort of green things, and that is a good PR strategy to talk about those things while having no rules around whether you can continue to invest in coal, oil, and gas, and keeping that side a lot quieter. So, I mean, other companies will have net zero pledges. I mean, it's fossil fuel companies are increasingly starting to set these kinds of targets. It's very funny, and what you'll see fossil fuel companies do is to focus in on what are known as scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which are their sort of operations, right? So their headquarters, the trucks, that they use in extraction. That does not include, of course, the oil and gas that they're selling to the rest of the world, which are scope 3 emissions, which they're very resistant to even disclose, let alone to bring down in sort of absolute terms. For them, I mean, it's mostly the same thing, right? It's to say that, look at all of if you're BP, right, look at all of the ways that we're financing wind turbines, look at all of our sort of clean energy arms that we're pouring money into. But when you look at the balance sheets, right, those low carbon investments will be a very small fraction still of their entire sort of spending in a given year. And there's an interesting push that's taken off in the last year or so by sort of activist investors. There's this thing called Engine Number 3, which got a number of seats on Exxon's corporate board to make Exxon more sustainable, which I think is a slightly dubious strategy from a number of perspectives. And the goal, is to bring Exxon in line with climate priorities, which for a business which is entirely built around digging up and selling oil and gas is a strange prospect. That is a strange thing to consider, that they would be a sort of good actor on climate. And happy to talk more about this, but it's I think it's very strange in part because it imagines as its end goal, and this is pretty rarely articulated, the idea that an Exxon or a BP could be transformed into a low carbon company, right? That they would be, a provider of wind and solar and invest a lot of money into those things. And, I think having Exxon run a clean energy economy is not, I would say, an enticing vision of the future, right? Those things should probably be public goods, or at the very, very least, probably not subject to the same whims of fossil capital that have defined the energy economy so far. And yeah, happy to talk more about that or something else.
Okay, well, thank you. That was great. And I'm going to open things up and pass it along to Obi, who will introduce this part of the show.
Thanks, Doug, and thank you, Kate, for the great and informative talk. Just gonna open it up to Stack for everyone else to speak. Just to remind everyone that everyone's here to learn, so please assume good intentions to be comradely. If you have a question, write Stack in the chat and we'll call on you. Please keep your questions brief. And if you have multiple questions, just write Stack again. And please keep all side conversations in the chat to a minimum while others are speaking. And pass it to Mia.
Thank you. Yes, I know people probably need a couple minutes to think about their questions. So also welcome for political ed members to drop some of their questions in. I'll put myself on Stack too because I have a question. Awesome. We're getting some people. Yeah, feel free to keep going. And once we are out of time, we will close off Stack. So let's go ahead with Obi first.
Okay, great. Thanks. In your talk, you mentioned the need for internationalism, and I would say that probably, or it's arguable that no other country other than us would be as important as China. But you pointed out in one of your articles a few weeks ago that it seems like the United States government is more keen on attacking China than passing any green legislation. You wrote about the House passed the Competes Act quickly, Build Back Better is stalled. So what does that mean for us, and how should we, what should we think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, as you mentioned, I wrote about this massive bill called the Competes Act, which passed the House a little while back. And it's been a little bit more off the radar in recent weeks with everything happening in Europe. But I think as the product of this pretty worrying trend among particularly hawkish Democrats, which is this sort of cynical logic that by finding a foreign enemy, we can rally the political will for domestic policy concessions, which would not be possible otherwise, right? And so if you have this bill which is aimed at competing with China, that is aimed, in some cases at beating China in certain export markets and building up our domestic manufacturing capacity such that we will either decouple entirely from China, which to note produces a vast majority of wind and solar. That is the sort of framing that will entice the right, that will entice Republicans to get on board with climate spending. If they found this sort of trick that will convince Mitch McConnell to get on board with deep decarbonization, and that on the one hand is pretty dumb because that has not been the case so far, right? It has not been the case that there has been massive bipartisan agreement for climate policy when it just slaps the sort of anti-China sticker onto itself. And on the other hand, it's worrying from a couple different angles. So one, is this very real rise in anti-Asian sentiment, including violence in this country, which I don't think can be talked about sort of in total isolation from a lot of the really hawkish rhetoric about China, under Donald Trump, but from certain arms of the Democratic Party as well. And that is not that is not something just continuing to ramp up rhetoric about China, which plenty of centrist pundits have been really eager to do to get sort of progressive policy passed, is dangerous in sort of the domestic sense. And looking at the sort of international scene, this isn't to say that I think China is a good actor on the world stage, or is full of or that the government there is full of comrades, certainly, but that there does need to be a certain amount of collaboration and cooperation with governments around the world, including those that we have disagreements with, in order to take on this crisis. And that is there are some more encouraging signs of that. I think there has been some acknowledgement of that, even from traditionally pretty hawkish arms of the kind of national security establishment, that there could be cooperation on China, even as sort of tensions have risen in other parts of the blob and the State Department and places like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the wrong strategy to just pretend that because hopes for comprehensive climate policy seem pretty bleak at this point, that the answer then is to turn toward this really hawkish approach and think we can sort of shepherd climate policy through that, because it hasn't worked, right? And historically the times when Democrats have appealed to the most sort of xenophobic, racist elements, thinking about fights like immigration reform, that just tends to drag the conversation much, much farther to the right, and to really create some quite, scary policies and keep sort of ramping up temperatures in a way that can be dangerous for people in the here and now. So I'm worried about that, particularly if if the conversation about Build Back Better ends and Biden starts sort of looking toward the midterms. And I think the urge of American politicians to try to like find an enemy to really rally people against is strong. And we've seen sort of signs toward that, particularly with China over the last year.
Awesome, thank you. And next is Steve.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I just want to kind of bring this back to something that I said in the beginning. I know it's based on a common misconception. I know, Doug, you had mentioned a little bit about the near-term cost of going to renewable energy. I think that's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how energy is priced. I think a lot of people, and they make it intentionally difficult to understand how energy is priced, because the fact is renewable energy tends to be cheaper. The way that we price energy in this, in New York specifically, and other markets as well, is we base it on something called a clearing price. Basically, the most expensive energy that gets in under a certain amount of energy we need is kind of how we price all of our energy. Every little bit of energy we get that's less than the most expensive energy out there, which generally tends to be what's it called? Peaker plants fueled by, largely speaking, mostly fracked gas. They tend to be very expensive. You don't have to look very far to see the impacts of this. When you base an energy grid that's dependent on gas, like ours in New York, you see gigantic spikes, like we saw this last month with Con Ed, or you see what happened in Texas. The fact is, deregulation has been an experiment that's been massively a failure in the United States, and it's moved us more toward dirty energy while being a failure. So I think it's important to note that there is ways that we can work locally to get renewable energy that's actually cheaper and actually better for working class people. Like we have a bill that we're working on here in New York called the Build Public Renewables Act. Basically, what that would do is it use our already created public institution. It's called NYPA, New York Power Authority, to help build renewable energy. You build a whole bunch of wind and solar that's cheap because it turns out it's cheaper to do things public. You're going to get a lot more energy on the grid, and that energy is going to be cheaper than the most expensive energy. Therefore, you're actually be bringing prices down while doing it. So actually, if we act quickly in the most effective and short-term way, we're actually going to lower prices in the short term.
Thank you for saying that. You're entirely right. And the part of most of my brain, the last 8 hours, I've been staring at the IPCC report, and for the last week, I've been in the muck of European energy markets and the Ukraine crisis. So thank you for bringing up the very obvious point, which is that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels and a much better investment in the short term, and better for for ratepayers as well. I don't really have much to add to what you said, other than to say that the Build Public Renewables Act, I think, is extremely exciting as a New Yorker, but also as a sort of blueprint for federal climate policy, and to look at these institutions which were built to provide public power. So things like rural electric cooperatives, for instance, the TVA, right? These are public institutions that have a mandate to serve people and not shareholders. And those are tremendous. There are tremendous opportunities for those to be drivers of decarbonization. And my hope is that NYPA can be a real example of that. And everyone should get involved with the Eco-Socialist group and support BPRA.
Cool. And I'm going to skip over myself and maybe tack on my question last, just to make sure the attendees have time to ask their questions, as well as other political ed committee people, if that's okay with you guys. So I will go to William.
Hi, everyone. I'm kind of stuck on the notion that, until the public really understands the engineering solutions, because it's a technical problem, okay? And there's an engineering solution, and there are simpler solutions than we're doing, cheaper solutions than we're doing, but the people who know them are not talking about them because they work for the energy companies. They're in the industry. All right. You can do distributed power. Like if you think about how like the internet, okay. So where is power? Where does power come from? And you can say, oh, it's that power plant in Queens or it's Niagara Falls. So where does the internet come from? It's kind of everywhere, right? I mean, there are data centers and so forth, but basically the internet is everywhere. My computer is a hub. It's in and out, right? Your home can be too. Your rooftop can be covered in solar panels. Forget about whether it points northeast or west, or you're using more kilowatt hours and you're producing more kilowatt hours than you use. That should be done. That should be accomplished with storage. There should be storage in everyone's basement. You should cover you cover 20% of the roofs in solar panels. You really don't need so much giant infrastructure. Okay. Like there's $11 billion going into giant wires. Now, New York City is another problem. You need that there. Okay. It's not that I agree with all the transmission and all that stuff and the NIPA projects upstate, like, building solar fields and wind power, because that's really clean energy. But they're also talking about bringing a ton of hydro from Canada, and that's not clean energy. People think that's clean energy. It's not clean energy. They flooded 750 square miles to make one of those dams. All that flooded material is decaying and turning into methane and poisonous gases that go up in the atmosphere. It's a recent study has said that one Canada dam is half as polluting to produce the same amount of energy as it would be with natural gas. Okay, which is an improvement over natural gas, but it's not clean.
Oh, well,
and people think like the whole world, like people say hydro and they're like, oh, clean hydro, Niagara Falls, but it's not. It's not. And people don't know it. And unless people know it, no one's going to.
So we can get to and ask your question if you have the question, just to keep it brief.
I mean, my question is what's going to happen? How does the public get to understand the technical aspects of the problems well enough to advocate for sensible? Because they don't, even the politicians, they get hydro is not clean.
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this question when it comes to the climate problem more generally, right? And there's been this idea for a long time that if there was, if there was enough sort of shared understanding of what the problem is, that would provoke a sort of level of political change. People would see that it's self-evident that there needs to be massive climate policy, that we need deep decarbonization. I'm not totally convinced that's right, and I think that has been a line that people have taken for a long time, and I don't know if we've seen the fruit of that. I mean, I think, and this is particularly relevant to work around energy and to decarbonizing energy systems, that when people see their cheaper bill, when people see that they're not having to pay pay as much to get gas pumped into their homes, and they're not breathing in toxins every day from their gas powered stoves, that is a real sort of change that people can feel. And it's why I've found DSA Eco-Socialist work around public renewables so exciting, because it's not sort of framing this necessarily in terms of technical problem, but allows a sort of way into those technical questions through their sort of experience as people who are sick of paying too much for energy, or sick of having to have this sort of polluting infrastructure in their homes every day. And I think that can be a good way to talk to people in the doors about it, and to open the door to a better understanding of our energy system, which is a tough thing for people. For me to it's my job essentially to understand a lot about the energy system, and I have trouble with it. And giving people sort of various routes in to that, I think can be really be really useful. Some people, yeah, might might come to this from wanting to really understand the whole system, from wanting a holistic picture for what our energy systems look like. Other folks, might just really hate Con Ed because they raised their bill last month, and I think that's a good campaign can sort of create a space for all those folks to get involved and to knock doors.
Have you listened to Saul Griffith? He's like a hot ticket on the webinar circuit right now, a really kind of pretty bright engineer who has he argues that distributed energy resources really are the answer because, and he also says, don't fight with those, because he's kind of from that realm. He writes the Sankey diagrams that go on the walls, like on these long walls of conference rooms in energy headquarters. And it's a way of showing, a way of educating executives as to how energy flows through the United States from source, gas, this, that, and other, and they break it down like a zillion different little things. You need really a giant wall to show all this stuff, right? And he makes those, but he, so he's kind of from that realm. He says, don't argue with those folks, you're never going to win. But he says, they should understand the economic argument that by distributing energy resources, you don't have to build giant infrastructure. You save yourself money. But the problem with that, the problem with his perspective is, they're never going to understand that because the government gives them $11 billion. Like they just do it, and these guys get $11 billion. Like this contract goes to some company that puts up the wires, but the wires are given to the electric company.
We have to move on with
They
the
act like they're making a profit.
You can put yourself on stack again if you have.
Sorry. Okay. Yep.
Thank you.
Taking too long. Yeah.
We have Patrick next, and just a reminder to please keep your questions and comments brief so that we can get to everybody. Patrick, go ahead.
I have a brief and perhaps overly broad question, but I was wondering if you could speak on the role of labor unions, at least on the national level, in terms of Green New Deal initiatives, what you see is what they're doing right and what they could do better, and maybe if you could speak on kind of international trade unions as well, if there's any discussion on that.
Yeah, for sure. I know a little bit less about the international trade union picture, though I'll say a bit about that. Domestically, when I first started covering climate politics circa like 2014, 2015, there were a couple of unions which would be really outspoken on climate things. So reliably, you would have UE, the old good old communist union, the National Nurses United, CWA would often come out in these fights and sign on to and send members in some cases to protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline, against Keystone XL Pipeline, would support various climate initiatives at the state level. A couple of scattered locals, like the IBEW, and locals in California who have a lot of work in solar, and that like very sort of small circle of unions I think has grown a lot in the last couple of years, including folks like the painters, who were obviously really involved with DSA's work on the PRO Act, and have been pretty excited about a Green New Deal, which I would be very hard to predict like 10 years ago. So that is really exciting to see that there's just like much wider swath of unions who are interested in this stuff, and more sort of kind of grassroots fights around at places like city labor councils. I know folks in Austin have pushed through a lot of sort of Green New Deal language there, up to the state AFL-CIO in Texas got through a pretty exciting resolution on led by a DSA member who is a carpenter. No, he's an electrician. Sorry, I think he's an IBEW member at the Texas AFL level, which is really great. And I mean, the depressing side of that is that you still have the sort of divide and conquer strategy that the fossil fuel industry really loves to deploy, that in particular will pit a lot of the building trades in particular against other labor unions. I will never forget seeing this letter that Layuna sent to it was addressed, I don't know, I forget if it was addressed to the nurses or not, but basically called other union members thugs for opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline. So, there's definitely an element of those sorts of politics that's still present, but that is starting to break a bit, I think, and I think part of that has been helped along both by rank and file members who are sort of calling out leadership as being out of step with in some cases the material interests of the union, but also just the interests of the working class more generally, and then on energy, that's always sort of complicated, just because you will see fights like in California, right? You'll have utility workers unions who will come out really aggressively against some climate policy, pro renewables policy. But I think the case, at least for some unions, I think electrical workers are a really good example of this, is starting to be a lot more evident that there's so much work to be had, in something like building upgrades, right? Work around local law 97 here in New York has been really exciting, just to see, that upgrading buildings is a tremendous amount of union jobs, more, so many jobs. And I think that's probably kind of the way, part of the way forward, is to really make the case that there's so much work, right, to be done in the building upgrades always come to mind for me, just because it's so huge, just in terms of sheer labor numbers, but also I think part of this is that a lot of leadership in some bigger international unions have not been so willing to fight for to organize new sectors. And so you have wind is more unionized, solar is majority non-unionized, really non-union in a lot of places, some pretty terrible working conditions, and that those are folks to be organized, and that that is an organizing project. And I think I've been sort of excited to be following the one member, one vote work going on at UAW, which could have pretty big implications for the electric car sector in particular, where auto buses have been really eager to put new battery plants and electric vehicle manufacturing in right to work states, outside of Michigan, which is also right to work state, of course, but to make sure, to try to make sure that workers who are building electric cars don't have good contracts. And it's very exciting to think about, if there is a slate of reform candidates from the rank and file who are elected to leadership in the UAW, kind of what that could mean for the standards for both that sector, but also more generally in thinking about a clean energy economy that is not sort of ceding ground to the Teslas of the world, to just roll out rampant labor violations and call themselves climate heroes for doing so. So yeah, I think the UAW fight is I think really great. And yeah, just to say again, the work around the PRO Act, which some of y'all have probably been involved in to some extent, or to a very serious extent, has been really great, just to see the sort of willingness of building trades unions and the painters in particular to sort of be working, side by side with DSA Eco-Socialist for a real transformation in labor law. And yeah, it's those very tangible, I think, shared struggles, which are I think a better thing to point to than this very sort of abstract jobs versus the environment debate, which is really circular, really theoretical, and yeah, wherever there's an opportunity to actually sort of work side by side with people, I think is the most helpful thing.
Okay, and then I see John wanted to get back on stack. Reminder, just keep it as brief as you can, so we can get to the last couple of people.
I feel like so much of what we're talking about and what I do activist work, everything seems so piecemeal, and we're trying to make the change and the transition from so many different directions. But I'm wondering if you, Kate, see any kind of particular trigger point that would, amongst all these things, that would perhaps tip power, like, be the tipping point of power away from the fossil fuel companies. Because all the things we work toward, we're all on the same page. We all see how obvious it is, but they're this thing that sits there and is immovable. And all the work is great, but as long as they're there, the transition doesn't happen. So I would love to know if you could address that. Is there a soft underbelly that could be pushed at, or a trigger point that could move them off the throne?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I'll start out with sort of a cop-out answer, which is to say that like a lot of things happen in politics that I don't expect to, and that's probably true of everyone. I don't think anyone that's called a pandemic necessarily, or the other myriad things that have happened in the last couple of years that caught many folks off guard, and that has been true in climate for me too. So when I kind of started reporting on this stuff, never thought we'd be talking about a Green New Deal. Never thought that kind of thing would be even in the sort of mainstream conversation, and things shifted very quickly. I mean, DSA helped elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So that was a big moment for climate policy. I think we'd be having a very different conversation about it if that hadn't happened. If there hadn't been, a lot of energy in New York, especially, and fully coming into 2019 after Democrats won back the House, I thought the entire conversation would be what level of carbon tax are we fighting for? And was prepared for a pretty miserable 2 years. It was miserable maybe in a different way, but thankfully there was a much bigger conversation about public investment as a solution to climate policy. So things can change quickly, and we don't always know how. That's the cop-out part of my answer. On the sort of soft underbelly front, I do think there is real opportunity, and the fossil fuel companies, especially if you're talking about Exxon, Chevron, these big companies, are not nearly as powerful as they were even a couple of years ago, and they know that. I mean, their share prices have been declining steadily for the last decade. They're now a pretty minuscule part of the S&P 500. They don't really, they're just not the players they were a while back. And most of the production that happens here is fracking, which is really vulnerable to any sort of economic volatility. And a lot of those companies went bust in 2014 when prices went down, and they're now, and again in 2020 when the price dropped to briefly below zero, and they're pretty scared. I mean, the investors aren't nearly as interested in funding them as they were before. So I think there is this sort of very much too slow trend, which is bad for them. But they are fighting for dear life and are still, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, a very powerful force in terms of making sure that good things don't happen, and in lobbying against any sort of climate policy from getting passed. But I do think they're vulnerable, and they're really unpopular as well. I wish there was the sort of I forget the name of it, but that thing in the Death Star where all the ships can go and you find the little button that you shoot and the whole thing blows up. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's one of those things, but I do think, the direction of travel for the fossil fuel industry is really bad. I will continue to argue for nationalization, and I think in its own way, rising gas prices and just like real animosity toward just how much basically rent they're collecting off of people, paying a lot to get to work and school, could drive a lot of popular animosity toward them, and sort of, lay the groundwork for things like a windfall tax, which, the EU just in the last couple of days has put out a proposal to tax profits and pour them into renewable energy, which I don't think would have happened like a year ago. But prices are going up. They're like rewarding their shareholders with enormous buybacks. And that, I don't think people are stupid, and like the sort of like inherent injustice of that seems pretty clear. So yeah, so I hope we might see something similar, and to go after them more. But I think they're weaker than they've probably ever been.
Carrington, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Kate, for your comments and your talk. So I guess I'm curious about internationalism and what you think might be entry points for DSA activists to engage with the global Green New Deal, or with the Green New Deal on a global level. And if you think something like the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, something like that could have a chance in coalition with partners. You don't have to get to the second part if there's no time, but maybe just at least the first part of the question. I know we just have a few minutes left. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think a lot about the NIEO, and and especially when it comes to oil and kind of commodity prices. I mean, people pay a lot of attention to what happens. The New International Economic Order, sort of formation of governments, a lot of post-colonial governments after the amid waves of decolonization in the 1960s and 70s, looking to sort of forge a economic order that was not sort of the subsidiary to the United States or the Soviet Union, specifically to produce a lot of sort of OPEC-style cartels over key commodities, and build a socialist world order, basically. There's a great book, World Making After Empire, by Adam Getachew, that sort of lays this out, and would recommend to everyone. On how to get involved with the Global Green New Deal. Yeah, so I mean, folks really pay a lot of attention in sort of international climate spaces to what is happening in the United States. And, the demands that I've heard over and over again from folks in climate justice circles in the global South, is that the U.S. should do two things: should decarbonize as soon as humanly possible, and provide climate financing that is commensurate to the climate debt that the United States owes the rest of the world. And on the first front, I think like a lot of the work that DSA is doing is probably advancing that conversation in some of the most productive ways I've seen. On the second, I think there is a lot of room, and I wish I knew what like a brilliant campaign around this would look like. But the sort of foreign policy conversation on climate is still just so stunted. And outside of UN climate talks, really have not seen demands, for things like, for instance, an expansion of special drawing rights at the IMF, which has been, a big sort of demand from climate justice groups, or things like debt cancellation, right? debt restructuring to, just make sure that, yeah, I mean, there's a basic sort of level playing field for folks to be able to embark on mitigation and adaptation. And I think that is a place where potentially like DSA is very well positioned to, run very interesting campaigns. Again, I like, I'm a writer, not a campaigner or an organizer. So maybe the wrong person to ask about that. But there are, folks doing really interesting work around some of those questions. Things like the Progressive International have gone after some of this, and potentially interesting links to be made with climate justice groups in the South, who I think are always, very excited to see solidarity on these, what I think in the North and in the US can be really kind of neglected questions of climate finance. So yeah, I mean, like, it's very old school to go protest an IMF meeting, but could be fun.
Awesome. And I'm just going to pass it off to Doug to close us out, and then please stick around for some quick announcements.
I have a brief question. I probably don't follow climate news as closely as I should because it makes me sad and anxious. So I'm curious, since you're immersed in this stuff, how do you avoid despair?
I'm a very good therapist. Truly, I mean, yeah, I have a really good therapist, and the ways that people avoid despair in other parts of their life, like mental health practice and hygiene. And I, personally, I think the way that I sort of cope with it is to find like a little chunk of it that seems like a really interesting puzzle to try to figure out, and then spend my day trying to, think about that, which as a writer is maybe a sort of strange way to go about it. But, I think in general, for folks who don't, that is not their job, being involved in organizing projects and being like a part of a community that is, really engaged in this stuff at the ground level is much preferable to like reading very depressing PDFs and books. And I spent truly the last 10 hours reading very depressing PDFs, and am excited to not be doing that when I get off this call. But yeah, I think like in absorbing this information is horrible. And to do that, I mean, both I think reading groups can be really good, but just having some sort of community, whether that's an organizing community, I think is great. Also just like having people who, are sort of on the same page to kind of talk through and think through and feel through these things with is pretty invaluable, to just not be grappling with this stuff on your own. And yeah, a good therapist is great.
All right, and take it away.
Okay.
Announcement. Sorry, Doug.
Oh, I thought I thought I was supposed to thank Kate and the attendees, but all right. But I just wanted to remind, just quote my old late friend Bob Fitch, who said that socialism must be social. So I think your last comments are a reminder of that. And so thanks, Kate. This was terrific. And thanks to everyone who participated. And now I think Steve is going to do some announcements.
Yes, indeed. And actually, that is the perfect note to move on to our first announcement, which is how we have this great organization, a great community of organizers here, organizing around eco issues, New York City DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group, which is really leading the nation on putting forward the Green New Deal, and also, let's say, internationally, let's hope, for God's sake, for all of our sakes. This Thursday, March 3rd, they are holding a virtual Green New York launch call, where you'll learn about our movement's history, victories, and how you can get in on the ground floor, take it to the next level. It's going to be packed with all the stars: David Alexis, Yapa Sauri Tupac, Sami Nemir Olivares, and Sarhana Shrestha. Plus special guests Zohran Mamdani, Jake Flores, Alex Patak, and Anders Lee of Pod Damn America. Great podcast, everyone should listen. And more to be announced. This is a watershed moment for Eco-Soc in the US, and we all hope to see you there. There is an RSVP link in the chat, I believe, or momentarily there will be. I don't know.
It's there. It got buried by the comments. Sorry, I'll post it again.
Oh, this is just so many comments. All right. Then we have petitioning going on for great candidate Sammy. Now, I think Sammy's trying to get a seat in sort of like Ridgewood area. I'm not sure entirely. Does anyone know where that is? Is it Ridgewood or is it like Cypress Hills? I don't know. So if you're out there, please check it out. Another one. So we also new members. DSA is, we're going into a new world, a new normal. The pandemic's over. We're facing God knows how many challenges right now with post-COVID world, with war, with potential nuclear war. So go join DSA, please. And there is a both a email to North Brooklyn DSA there, and a link where you can join. And please come to our events. Furthermore, this committee itself can be yours. You can join North Brooklyn Political Ed and help, put on other projects, stuff that you want to talk about. And that email is nbk.poly.ed@socialists.nyc. And I think that's about it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kate. We really appreciate it. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kate. Good night, everyone.